And of course, you can contact, if you're taking classes with either professor, if you're having trouble finding that link and you want to rewatch any part of this, then I'll be sharing it with them as well, so that they can help you out. Okay, so let's see. My first question for both of our panelists is, what made you choose your major?
Go ahead, Omar, Professor.
Okay. I'll go ahead. Well, I grew up in a family where history was really important in our family. Both of my parents were Pan-Africanists, and of course I was born in the 60s. And they were very intent that we kind of know our history as people of the African diaspora, but also the history of this country. They tried to teach us a little bit about the history of indigenous people and other folks on the continent. So I've had a love of history, just coming out of a familial culture that embraced it. I kind of learned to dislike it intensely in the public school system. And of course, this is a long time ago, where I didn't hear it being taught in a way that reflected the experience of my community, and also quite inaccurately. And so as I started to have my own family and made a decision to homeschool my children, in conjunction with several other families, I became the historian, and I was the one teaching. I eventually decided to go back to graduate school and get my PhD and become a history professor. So that's how I chose my major. I think my major chose me about 50 years ago when I was about 7 years old, quite frankly. I like to teach. I think I like to teach, not just because I like to hear myself talk, although I can be a bit verbose, but also I like to give my students the opportunity to bring their history into the classroom, right? And to connect with whatever historical narrative I'm laying out there, right? And because a lot of people everyone has their own really interesting history, and they have their own these stories in people's families and people's cultures and people's communities. So I like to kind of I enjoy that part of teaching, certainly the interaction with my students. So that's how I chose my major in my profession.
I think with me, it's similar to what Professor Omar mentioned. It was more than anything, I always kind of, around where I grew up, there was an old barn that was over 100 years old. And I always kind of had this inkling, okay, what's the history behind it? So I'm very kind of passionate about community history. And so so that's kind of how I got into, okay, what are these streets named after, right? I was born in Mexico, so when I came here at 8 years old, I can speak English, but I knew the names in Spanish, the street and everything like that. So there was something there connected me to history in the past. And so that's where I kind of geared into looking at community history. And so that's actually what I've done, a lot of research in local communities. I'm excited to research the Inland Empire for sure. But that's kind of what drove me in terms of just finding the past through these local history, right? We always kind of look at the bigger scale, the bigger picture, or the great man approach to history, but the backyard history is what I'm really interested in, because it really kind of helps solidify students' understanding of history and connect it to something that's relevant, which is their community. With that being said, in one of my classes, or my students had to do their own kind of personal family history, and have to interview their family through an oral history project. And then they have to put their history in the context of US history. So putting themselves and their families in the historical timeline, which students didn't really enjoy.
I think what both of you said that's really interesting is that you're both interested in communities and their connection to this, because a lot of times for students who take history in maybe like high school and elementary, they think history is the study of like dates, right?
Yes.
Like memorizing dates and memorizing events. but you're talking about like, no, we're thinking about communities and how changes affect communities, and how this is influencing how we live our lives today and things like that. So I think that's really interesting, and I think that's probably a difference in terms of how history is taught in the college level compared to high school, and that there is that kind of critical thought, right? That you're making those connections, whether you're learning about the history of your people, or connections between different populations. So I think those are both really interesting insights that you both shared. My next question is, what were some influential classes that you took? So both inside your major and outside of it.
Okay, I'll start with outside first. And you might have heard of this book because it was an anthropology class, Professor Tripp. So I took an cultural anthropology at Humboldt State University. It's Cal Poly now, but anyway, and we read this book called "The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down," and it was basically something that actually happened with a Hmong family in the Central Valley, where the child was experiencing seizures, right? And the way that the family like traditionally kind of approached that particular problem, right, that situation, and the way that medical science approached it clashed. And it ended up just somewhat tragic because like the state takes the child, they vilify the family, and then it turned out the family were kind of more on point, like their culture, these practices they had in this so-called underdeveloped culture were actually closer to the truth. And that really, and how's that related to history? Well, again, it's like so often, again, in high school, in junior high, you're taught this kind of top-down version of history that's so disconnected from who you are. And it's kind of the approach is as if you're from, especially if you're from a marginalized community, or even if you're the descendant of Greek immigrants or something, right? It's everything's so disconnected from your own story, right? That it's kind of almost, it's almost like you're studying the history of a foreign country. So I guess that class was very influential in that to this day, I'm interested in like marginalized communities. I'm interested in what they call like kind of micro histories. I did my dissertation on a very small ethnic group in the southern Philippines who fought a pitched battle with the U.S. Army in 1906 that no one's ever heard of, right? So I think it's because of that, right? Because I'm interested in those histories that are kind of hidden. So that's a class outside of my major. In terms of inside my major, I guess I would have to say it was a series of classes. My dissertation chair, Frank Castigliola, at University of Connecticut, he's fairly well known in circles of diplomatic historians, and that was kind of my emphasis is African American history and history of U.S. foreign policy, and so a lot of his approach to looking at U.S. foreign policy was to explore how American ideas about gender and race, right, often drove or heavily influenced policy amongst these mostly white men, frankly, who felt that they were realists and felt that they had a cold, hard logic to what they were doing. But then when you look closer at things like the U.S. foreign policy in Vietnam, it was all about saving face and not looking like weak men, right? A lot of it was, right? So those are the two that I can think of right offhand that I think really kind of influenced me to be more interested in race and the history of race and in gender and how gender is constructed differently in different societies, how it's fluid, how it changes over time, and the impact that it has on institutions and on historical events. There you go, Professor Luis.
Thank you. So I think for me, it was more of the general ed was a form of kind of sampling what different majors I would like. I initially considered myself a political science major, so I took some political science courses, but then I took some Chicano history classes or ethnic history classes. And again, those were kind of like geared me towards one of the things that I started researching in those classes is the land grants, in the process of land grants that were given to large Californios or Mexicans in the Southwest prior to the Mexican-American War. So I was kind of always interested in Chicano history, ethnic history, and then kind of went into history in general with, as we all know, the research just kind of goes down the rabbit hole and just becomes so much interesting in what we do. But I guess, so it might have been the political science, for sure, the Chicano studies courses, and then obviously the history courses, the community history courses that I took, the public history courses. Those were kind of the ones that just solidified me in terms of wanting to do.
Great. So hopefully, maybe if some of these topics sound interesting to you students, then these can be avenues that you can look into. We just have a new ethnic studies department that has just formed at Chaffey College. We have 2 new professors that are full-time. So Patricia Gomez and also Professor Zamora. So they are teaching ethnic studies brand new this semester, next semester, every semester now, because now they are here with us. So if that's something of interest to you, definitely check out their courses. I know they have a general ethnic studies course, and then there's a Native American studies one, and I believe there's also a Latin American studies one. I'm not sure what else is on the books yet, but those might be of interest if you're interested in communities and history. They touch on those themes. So my third question is, what is an obstacle that you faced in college and how did you overcome it? And I should also mention, students, the 3 of us are all in classrooms that have lights that turn off. So that's why Professor Fernandez's lights off. So if it happens, spooky season, it's.
Okay, I guess I'll go ahead and answer that. I've been trying to think about this question. I guess I was in school as an older student, a non-traditional older student. And so I always thought less of things as obstacles and more as challenges because I wasn't going to remove them. I just had to deal with them. So I guess, and maybe there's some people who are on here who can relate to this. I was a parent. I was married and a parent throughout graduate school, and throughout much of my undergraduate career, I had a family. So of course I had to provide for my children. I had to be a parent. I had to work and I had to go to school. So I would say that was a challenge. I wouldn't say it was an obstacle. I can't really think of, again, the obstacle. I can't think of any specific obstacles that, were that stick out other than that. And I guess the way that I dealt with that, and I encourage my students, I try to, as much as I can, encourage them, is to develop good time management skills. Don't wait till the last moment to get assignments done. I know it's tempting to do it, and I've done it. I admit to having done that, but when you don't do that, when you prepare, like if you got a couple of papers due that semester, and you know what the topic is, start making notes and putting together rudimentary outlines well before the paper is due. Grab a few articles. You don't even have to read them, just print them out or download them, whatever. I print them old, and put them aside so you have them, right? Time management, I think, is really important. I think a lot of my students work, so I assume community college, that's most of us work when we're community college students. And I know it's really challenging to work and go to school, but it's all about time management, actually writing out a schedule about how much time you're going to put into each class for studying, for writing, for research, etc. And then, and maybe even another thing to do is, maybe get books on tape and listen to them as you're going to pick up your kids or going to go grocery shopping and those kinds of things, right? So yeah, that would be the only thing I could call anything approaching an obstacle, really, was having to be, father, husband, provider, and student, Then this was throughout graduate school and much of undergraduate school. But again, I think because I pretty decent time management skills, I was able to, thank God I was able to pull it off. Okay, Professor Luis.
Thank you. So for me, I am a first generation college student. So I would just call it an obstacle in terms of navigating higher education, because often, I mean, I don't have nobody to guide me, and I'm pretty sure a lot of students can relate to where I'm coming from, that I had to like figure that on myself, on my own. And now that I'm here at the community college, Chaffey College, I want to kind of serve to help us. We're here to help you navigate through that. And so I had to kind of ask questions and knock on doors and figure out like, what do I want to major in, and so I think that was one of those things that was kind of very difficult for me to kind of figure things out where there was nobody else to kind of lend me a hand per se. It's like I had to figure it all myself. And so I know, and then also the balancing of work and in school. I worked for 10 years at CVS Pharmacy. So I went from a clerk to a manager or supervisor. So 10 years of retail. You want to talk retail, we can talk retail. But again, it's just where we came from, kind of where you're at. You know what I mean? We understand where you're coming from, whether you're a parent, where you're first generation college students kind of thing. We're here for you. Our doors are open if you want to talk about that. We didn't just kind of get this position, it came out of nowhere, right? We're a product of hard work and dedication, the similar struggles that all of you are going through.
I think one of the things that Professor Fernandez mentioned that's important is he said I was knocking on doors and talking to people. So some of this could be just about finding the right people to help you. We have so many amazing resources at Chaffey College, so many, and more are added every year. And a lot of times as a student, you might not know what exists out there. So what I'd encourage you to do is, if you are struggling with something, reach out to your professors and see if they're able to help you, because we understand that your success is not just about academics, right? That you could have other things going on. So, finding out about EOPS, for instance, like if you are a parent, and EOPS also helps to service people who are new to learning English, and a variety of, different individuals fall into that category. So, socioeconomic status that might be lower or something. There's a variety of different kinds of resources that are out there, and we can help to guide you to them. So definitely reach out when you are having some of these obstacles, because as both professors have mentioned, we chose these careers intentionally, right? Like, we wouldn't have gone through all the work if we hated people. I mean, we're here because we want to be here, and we're here because we want to help guide you to be successful. So utilize all of that help, and don't be afraid to go to office hours. I know sometimes it can feel kind of intimidating, but it's going to be okay. I promise nobody's going to bite you. Yes.
Sorry, let me unmute. No, I just wanted to actually reinforce what you just said, Professor Tripp, to everybody here, that, I hate to sound like one of those people, but I'm going to sound like one of those people, that a lot of the stuff they offer here, like, there wasn't this kind of support, not even at the community college level when I was in community college in like the 80s and 90s. Like, no way. No, and even now I have a 17-year-old at community college up north, Berkeley City College. There's nowhere near the level of support that I see at Chaffey. And I'm not just Cetriv, I'm not just saying that because I work here. A lot of the things that are offered here, you're definitely not going to get this kind of support at the UCs that I saw anyway. I certainly didn't see it at Davis, where my daughter went. So take advantage of the writing, the language success center, which will help you with your writing, EOPS. And yeah, I mean, we're at community colleges because we want to teach community college, right? Because you get to, like, for lack of a better term, you get to be with the people, like your people, like class-wise, right? And we've shared a lot of the same experiences you guys have. So please, come ask us questions. Yeah, I didn't know you did CBS. I did Borders Books for a while. Retail. Oh my God. That would've been-
Consumer value stores, that's what it stands for. I'll add to that.
I
That's
didn't know that. Okay, cool.
I do want to add one thing, and it's just with regards to, we're in the business of student success, so we want to make sure that you succeed. And then even if you're not my student, you can drop by and ask questions. I mean, we're very accessible. Want to make sure that we'll guide you through. I think we're always kind of networking within the college to make sure that if you have a question, we'll get you, if we don't have the answer, we'll find that answer for you and make sure that get you in the right path.
And I see that Professor DeFrepolis, he shared his office number in the chat in case you ever want to ask questions or drop by for office hours. So that can be really helpful. And so did Professor Fernandez. Yeah, really, really important. I actually, the other day, I finished a course and these two gentlemen walked in and they said, I want to improve my English. And I said, okay. And they said, we're here for ESL. And I said, I don't teach ESL. Are you a student at Chafee yet? And they said, no. And I said, okay, I just finished my class. The GPS center is closed. How about I walk you to the international students office because they were international students. Let's find somebody who can help you there. So we genuinely care about your learning and want you to be a part of this. So don't ever think that reaching out is a bad thing. I myself was also a first-time college student. I didn't know how to navigate and I was just blindly kind of like trying to figure things out. And my life would have been so much easier if I did just kind of reach out. So it's a good skill to have because once you learn about the resources, then when you transfer, you can see, do those resources exist where you transfer? And if not, who should I contact to find out more information? So my next question is, describe your participation in any internships, job, or fieldwork that was relevant to your major, or even those that are irrelevant. Any kind of experience that you have and kind of what you've learned from it would be helpful.
Okay, so I guess what I first thing that came to mind when I thought of that was my dissertation research. I spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives going through Leonard Wood's papers and Theodore Roosevelt's papers and papers from the U.S. Army, like after action reports on battles in the Philippines. And so, spent a lot of intimate time with the thousands of pages of primary sources. I actually still have them. And that was a really great experience for me in the sense that it reinforced this kind of maxim I've adopted, that if you really want to understand something, like you really want to understand why, for example, why did the Southern states secede and go to war with the United States of America? It's very easy to go back and look at the primary documents and they'll actually tell you why they did it, right? It's not in, and it's the kind of thing that it's kind of odd that's one of the things I have my students like discuss in one of their first papers, because it's kind of out there in the public as if that's something that is controversial. And there actually is no controversy amongst historians. You know why? Because they all wrote down the reason why they did it, right? And so just learning the value of primary sources, right? Where people are taught, they literally say, we want to preserve slavery and the position of, the white race, yada, yada. They don't make any bones about it. Unlike modern day neo-Confederates, they're very straightforward. So that was a really great experience for me. Of course, being in the Capitol and all of that, and, it's incredibly hot and humid and unbearable. Just, seeing kind of the Washington Monument and Lincoln Memorial, but definitely being in those spaces, in those archives, being able to examine these documents, but, you could take pictures of them and everything and keep them for later so that you can mark them up. Again, took me to a place where now when I assigned U.S. history in my U.S. history course, and all my history courses, I always assign primary sources. It's much preferable to me than a textbook, because that's what teaches, that's how we learn the art of interpretation, right? And this is where, again, you can get get it straight from the horse's mouth in terms of trying to figure out the motivations of people in the past and what kind of world they lived in and what kind of world they envisioned in the future, right? So yeah, I would list that as an experience that really impacted me. Dr. Fernandez.
Thank you. So for me, when I was in grad school, I was very fortunate. One, going back to the idea of kind of visiting your professors, they get to know you, you get to know them. That's crucial because you know what? Then later on, you can ask them for letters of recommendation to your grad school and for all this stuff. So that relationship is so important. I was asked to be part of or assistant curator to a museum exhibit. And so for a year, we worked on putting this exhibit on school segregation for the Mendez versus Westminster case. This is back in 2012, 2013. The exhibit is still there. It's a traveling exhibit. It won an award of merit by the American Association of State and Local History. So I was getting myself in these kind of cool projects that maybe I didn't get paid or maybe I got a stipend, but I was building my CV or my academic resume. So that was one of them. The other was that I got to work at a library. And so part-time, and then because they knew that I had a history background, they put me in the history room. So that was very interesting because I was looking at historic criminal records of the city of Santa Ana, where, you know, if your horse was riding in the 1800s more than 25 miles per hour, I don't know how they found out it was 24 miles an hour, but you would actually do some time for that. And so it's just, again, you're just surrounded by archives and you get sidetracked about just finding all these little cool things about if your, you know, horse defecated in public, you didn't clean it up, you go to jail. So it was just all these kind of cool stuff within the archives aspect. The librarian eventually also asked me to kind of pick out books for the history section. And then one of my research, I was actually served as a research assistant for the Cesar Chavez Department of Chicano and Chicano Studies in 2013. And then I also was conducted a couple oral histories, some that I got paid, some that I did not, or oral history interviewing people with historical importance to preserve the historical record. And so again, the other thing that I did was for 6 years, I served as the executive director of the Dominguez Rancho Adobe Museum, where, you know, I was surrounded by the historical site, how to preserve that, develop programming and stuff like that. So again, it's very unique major. It's definitely something that you can utilize in different areas. But again, the idea of getting to know your instructors and the networks that they have, they'll ask you to serve on a project, you build your own resume, and it helps you build your resume or your academic CV.
Both of those, such fantastic information, lots and lots there. When I'm listening to both of you, it kind of sounds like it really kind of ignited and like solidified what you wanted to do because you were enjoying being at the archives and learning about these tangents or learning more about things that you were interested in. So I think that can be an important part of any kind of internships, field works, or experience that you have, because it helps you realize, like, yes, this is what I want to continue to pursue. I always tell students, like, when you hear about opportunities, if you can take them, take them. Because even if you do that opportunity and you find out that is not for me, that's an experience. And that's really important. I know for myself, I did a lot of internships within the field of anthropology. I did 2 different museum internships, and I learned that museums were not where I wanted to be for a variety of reasons. But a lot of times they put me in the back doing some type of archiving or cataloging, and I was too social, and I was like, I'm by myself. What am I doing here? So I didn't enjoy doing that. I also had trouble like framing exhibits where they'd say, okay, here's all this stuff, you know, put it up on the wall. And then I would get this anxiety, like, I don't know how to organize any of this, you know, like I would like to help somebody. So the reason I bring this up is because sometimes you do an internship and you can find out in the process, like, well, that aspect wasn't for me, and it can help guide you to something that you are excited about. Like they're mentioning, like you can see how much fun they had, you know, working in those archives or going to the Capitol and connecting with history in different ways. Okay, so can you describe a couple of career paths that a student might not know about that are connected to history? So I know I get this question a lot. My family was like, what are you going to do with anthropology? So now's your time to tell them what can they do with history.
Do you want me to go first? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, so so I have several I thought of. Okay, so I don't know. I feel like having a degree in history, first of all, you're honing like interpretive skills and analytical skills, right? And these are kind of skills that are useful in almost anything. They're useful in terms of even if you're working in business, even if you're going to go into medicine, right? Knowing maybe the history of medicine, or I teach a lot about eugenics, the history of pseudo science, and how medicine is impacted, right, by human beings and human societies. Law school, if you want to be a lawyer, a good place to start is history, especially if you want to know the history of the Constitution and the history of laws around, laws around whatever, segregation, immigration, business law, what have you. If you want to become a public school teacher, or high schools and middle schools, they're catching a lot of pressure now about what they can and can't teach. This is a good, if you want to be a revolutionary and go in there and fight the fight, this is a good time to do it. Get your history degree and get a teaching certificate. If you're interested in joining the diplomatic corps, I just giving a lecture on Vietnam the other day, and I was referencing in the 1950s during the Red Scare, how they purged the State Department of all these Far East historians, right? Accusing them of being communists. And also of being, a lot of them, it was because they're accused of being gay men. And so the problem with that is when it came time to deal with Vietnam, there were no Far East specialists left, right? So that really crippled that. Think about the history of the Vietnam War and how it could have been different if we had those people in place. So, knowing history, like we had said, it's not just a bunch of dates and arbitrary dates. It's a total narrative. The dates are kind of these benchmarks, so you can organize the narrative, or you can organize the trajectory of events. But it's more about understanding human societies, right? Looking for patterns, right? And maybe how to break those patterns, but also understanding patterns and understanding societies, right? And as the world becomes more global, I would say, not just the US history, South Asian history, history of the Middle East, right? We definitely could use some Eastern European historians right about now. History of the Ukraine, history of Russia, right? Other jobs can be, if you want to go into national security, oh, well, I guess you can work for the CIA. But yeah, there's a myriad of things you can do. And I'll turn it over to Professor Hernandez to talk more about this.
Thank you. I'm of the belief is that you make the degree whatever you want it to make, right? It's how you market yourself, how you promote yourself, and everything else. A degree is 50%, the other is the person, right? And that's how I look at it. And just make sure that you're networking and all that stuff. So, I mean, within history, you can go into kind of what I mentioned in terms of some of my experiences working in archives, right? As assistant archivist, or or a history room like I did. And also working in a museum environment as well, just as the executive director position that I did, and working with as a curator doing exhibits, right? One of the things that it's so interesting about history is that it grounds you. It gives you a breadth and depth of understanding of the world around you. And I think that's just so valuable in terms of knowing why we're here and how this developed. And I think that is something that is just unique in terms of the background that we bring in. We don't sit around just kind of quiz each other on dates or anything like that. Of course, if you ask friends what you do, you kind of lose friends because like, oh, history was not my greatest subject in high school, and that's because they perceive that it's just we're just kind of memorizing dates, right? But again, those are the the degrees that, I mean, the field that I would argue could actually, you can go into. I will tell you something about 2 years ago that one of my friends reached out to me, and they were looking for, there's a production company in Hollywood that was looking for somebody, a historian, to kind of give historical context of the 1940s. And I said, sure, I'll do it. And then what they did is that they helped me sign an NDA, right? Make sure I wouldn't talk about their project. And when they were talking about, excuse me, I lost my voice here. So one of the things that happens is that they were looking at 1940s about this program that they're trying to develop, this pilot show. And they kept using these words, and they're like, those are not historical context words. They were just kind of using it in the present, but not talking the 1940s. And so then I met with the writers and stuff like that through Zoom. This is kind of at the peak of COVID. And I was able to provide a deeper understanding of what they needed, right? Now, that might be a very, very niche field, but it's very interesting to actually, they're like, oh yeah, that's interesting. But especially how they use words, and it's not without the historical context. And you know how we're a stickler for that, Professor. Like, that's not even the right time period, but sure, but that's one of the things that I did that was pretty neat in terms of consulting.
I think another important thing that you both have mentioned about history is in terms of like whose stories get to be told and whose stories are highlighted, because in a traditional sense, when we are taught history in elementary school and middle school and high school, it's taught through this whitewash perspective where a lot of times we are just learning things from one perspective. Things are changing now, right? With ethnic studies being a part of the curriculum in high school. But I think knowing the history of your ancestors, your people, that can be powerful in a lot of different career fields, like they're mentioning, or, just knowing the history, like Professor Omar is saying, when you're talking about like knowing about Ukrainian history or Polish history or something like that, all of that is important in terms of connecting world events and thinking about how things impact people in the present or potentially in the future. So I think those are really important points. Like, there's so much more to history than just one specific date in the past. So hopefully that gives you all an idea of a variety of, career options and fields that you could go into with having that background. So those were my 5 questions for our panelists, and I have to apologize that Professor Laguna was not able to make it at the last minute. So we're going to reschedule with him in the future. Well, I'll reschedule with him in the future and have him on a future panel. So if you're here to see him, I'm sorry that he was not here, but I'd like to see what kind of student questions we have. So feel free to either raise your hand or type in the chat box or unmute yourself. We are here.
I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Luis was talking about, the movies. I was thinking about how many movies I've sat through with friends, and I just really have to clench my jaw and not be obnoxious because they're using the totally wrong slang. And you're just like, stop it. But yeah, that is certainly, I think that's important. There's a lot of historical movies coming out lately, I feel like. So yeah, that it's a niche, but I'm sure those people are compensated quite handsomely.
Yeah, definitely makes for some better accuracy while you're watching the movie.
Civil War general saying, dude.
We have a question from Mark. So Mark says, thank you all for your insight. How did you start a career in history if your employment background is different?
I'll tell you, my story is I when I was younger, I wanted to be a history major, and I was discouraged by people at every turn. Saying, so I wish I'd have just went ahead and done it. But what that just goes to show you. So I just, and I started a family pretty early in life. So I was mostly concerned with, I got to provide for my family. So I spent I spent most of my years in telecommunications, working in call centers, and of course those jobs kind of migrated out of the country. So and I've done all kinds of stuff. I don't even want to go into my resume. I did retail, I sold cars, I worked in group homes, I've done all kinds of stuff. But anyway, yeah, I think that's just the path you take in life. Especially again, I married early, started a family pretty early, so my primary concern was providing. Little did I know I could have been providing a lot sooner, but I just went with what I wanted to do. So that's how I ended up gravitating back into history, which was my first love. Professor Fernandez, what about you?
I think, yeah, I mean, we just kind of needed to have a job to support ourselves while we're going through school, right? CVS Pharmacy was the longest I stayed there. It's a decade. That's 10 years that I stayed there. But before that, I worked at McDonald's as I was a teenager, and then even after I left CVS Pharmacy, I also worked for the library, like I mentioned, and or the archives, and then I worked for children's services for a while at the same time I was part-time faculty teaching. So I think the core is it's a process, right? It's an evolution of you as a person and a professional that, once you get those degrees, you kind of, the opportunities open, right? And so that's where we're at. We didn't just landed that ideal job right out of college. It's a process of us evolving, but more ideally that these jobs that we held build us, right? And build our character. I consider myself a Frankenstein of sorts because I can talk retail, I can talk, archives, I can talk McDonald's combo number one, what it is, what it involves. So, it builds us, right? It builds who we are as individuals, and definitely builds our character.
I wanted to add too, in terms of career paths with history, the majority of US politicians are lawyers or former lawyers. We do not really have diversity in terms of the background. So imagine, right, if you had a background in Chicano history or, African-American history or any kind of history, how powerful that would be in terms of how valuable it could be when we have some of these discussions, that we're hearing where we're like, that's not even accurate. That doesn't even make sense. So that could be something potentially as well, maybe, going into politics.
Yeah, I see a question. Mr. Roldan had a question.
Yes, I see this question about people wanting to break into academia, specifically being a professor. So it says it seems really competitive and scarce. What is your advice and perspective on this? And what would some paths be to accomplish these goals?
I would say don't be too freaked out by the talk of how competitive and scarce it is, because number one, that's going to change. I think that it's cyclical. Number one. Number two, I think like the new frontier is cyber online education. I think any way that you can kind of stand out as somebody with those kind of skills, maybe even starting and I don't have those skills, so I'm but just even like starting blogs, generating a following on social media, right? Engage in kind of open air research, and collaborative stuff online. That I would say starting there. Also, I would say if you want to go into academia, if that's where you really feel like you want to be, then go ahead and pursue that goal and give 100% and be the best at whatever you're going to go into. And that's what makes you competitive. Putting in that hard work, honing your skills, and of course, network with folks, Also, you cannot, here's another thing. If you want to teach in California, go to school in California. And you make those connections, because that's, I feel like that's kind of how you get the jobs, and that's how you wherever you're doing your graduate school is a pretty good chance you might end up staying there or in that region, because those jobs are near you. People know you in that particular region. So that's the advice I would give. Don't not do it because people are telling you it's too competitive and it's scarce. Everything's competitive now. Everything's scarce. and things are changing so rapidly with technology. I would say develop a knowledge of technology, social networking, on the internet, and create your own network of professionals, right? And stand out, do something unique, maybe even use YouTube or use whatever, Twitter, whatever, to develop a following, talking about something intelligent, analytical, and deep, and not just what everybody else is doing. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it just comes down to what I said earlier, is that 50% is the degrees, the other is the person, right? And then the ability of you networking and getting yourself out there. I think if you look at competitiveness within, like Professor Omar mentioned, every place is competitive. So it's not like this niche that it's only, some of us do it. But there also, you see that every other place is competitive. When I used to work at the museum, I used to have a lot of communications interns. And, they wanted to work in public relations and all this stuff in Hollywood. And I would always tell them, like, look, everything's competitive. It's you putting yourself out there, right? If you don't apply because you're thinking it's too competitive that you're not going to get it, then you're putting yourself out of that equation. Right. And so that's just part of, if you look at the grander scope of the job and job fields, everything's competitive. It's not just this niche of academia that is competitive. Every other place is competitive. But if I can add a little bit more, the highest, happiest professions are professors, right? Lawyers, and for some reason, not to bag on the lawyers, but they're the most unhappiest people that I've come across. But professors, when they do nationwide studies, it's always the people who work in academia who are the happiest, because one, they're mentoring and the future generations, but also they're doing what they love. They're publishing, they're in the field and stuff.
And I can definitely say at 57 years old, I've been working since I was my family's restaurant from 7. And then my whole life I've worked. And this is the only job I've ever had where I seriously hate not coming to work. Like, I can't bear to miss a day. Like, I really love coming to work. And I'm not just saying that. I really do. To me, it's kind of weird. Having a day off, it's like, what are you going to do, really? Right. So, I think if you want to be in academia, go for it, dude. Go for it, because quality of life over the long term, I think it's healthier, both mentally as well as physically, to be happy and fulfilled at what you're doing.
To echo what they're both saying, like, yes, it is competitive, and yes, like, everything is competitive. But if you are passionate about something and you work really hard to be good at that, because I don't think that people are just like a natural at everything, right? But if you want to be a professor and you're like, oh, I really love doing research, but I'm not very good at public speaking, work on that, right? Like, work on all aspects of the thing that's related to the job that you want to do. And if you follow your passion, then you're going to get there. You're going to stand out as being that individual who took these opportunities, who utilized resources, who rises to the top above that, because that was what you wanted to do. So hopefully that's helpful, what our panelists have added. Looks like we have another comment. Thank you so much, professors, very helpful. We have a couple more minutes. Did anybody else have any other questions that you'd like to say to our panelists?
I think we could actually use this time to shameless self-promote our courses, Professor. Sure. Take our courses, in the spring. We're History 70, History 71, and I'll let Professor Omar.
My History 50, I have History 50 in the spring, then in the fall I have 51. These are African American history, and I think you will still find it interesting if you're not African American. African American history, Chicano history, this is all of our history, right? And so I encourage you. My History of the 60s class is a lot of fun. If you, especially if you like music and the history, I talk about the history of rock and roll and how it's connected to the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and this sort of thing. And that's history 20. So history 20, history 50, history 51, and history 18, those are the ones I teach. History 18 and 17, which you have to take those anyway, US history. But yeah, so yeah, take our classes.
Right. I don't see any other questions. Thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for our panelists for dropping by. I hope that you feel like this was helpful for you, that you do end up taking some history courses at Chafee. And also maybe if you see any of us around, just say hi, right? Ask questions. Like we are here to help you. So hopefully this is kind of a humanizing experience, because I know that a lot of you might still be online and you might be taking a course with either of these professors and never had the chance to really interact with them. So, so hopefully this was a valuable experience for all of you. Anybody want to add anything before we check out?
No, I'm good. Just thank you, everybody, for coming. I look forward to seeing you, some of y'all in my classes, and in Professor Fernandez's classes and Professor Tripp, you know.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I just want to kind of reemphasize that we're here for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop by our office and, help you answer or navigate higher education in general. Oftentimes you need somebody to kind of help you do that. And I'm here for you, and we're here for you for that. We're in the business of student success. So.
Yeah, so Miss Washington had a question. If there's going to be a Zoom on. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So Miss Washington, I'm going to reschedule with Professor Laguna in the future. So he was from gerontology, public health. So gerontology is interesting because it kind of straddles both fields. But there might be other public health panels that are happening this semester. So you can definitely look into that, like look at the Career Center's webpage or check out Chafee's social media page to see if there are any upcoming ones that are just specific to public health, if that helps.
Thank you, Professor
All
Tripp.
right.
Thank you, Professor.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great Halloween and Dia de Muertos.
Careful out there.
Stay safe, everyone.
All
Don't
right.
overeat the candy.
There you go.